And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a little tour. So, so this is, this here is the entrance to the gallery, the first floor gallery. So you come in here, this is the reception area. And then, so like, as if you were walking in, this is what you would see. This is the view that you would see. So come in, reception, and then right here, we start with Bosnia. And then there is Sabine's powerful work. This is, Sabine and Dorothy make works about the partitions of Mexico and Germany. And then there is Leah's video. So there we have the partition of Cyprus, and then Roman Rogoik is the photographer who, got special permission to take photos of the Green Line. So that's this photo book. This here is Maria Mushtaq, who made works about the partitions of Kashmir. And then here we have Partition of Palestine by Manal Deeb. And here is Nadine's beautiful works, the photo prints. So we are now into, and then here is Jaffa's photo prints and her videos. And then here we have Gail's work. So now we are into Partition of Ireland. So this is the Partition of Ireland. This is Gail's and Ursula Burke. And then here is Anad's beautiful woodcuts here. And then I have one of his prints paired with Raisa Kabir's video, where she's making map of Bangladesh using weaving techniques, so sort of conceptually rather than literally. And then here we have Sabine's video about memory. And Sabine, I'm gonna have to ask you to explain that when we start, the whole process of, how memories process it generationally and how you think about it and whatnot.
Okay.
And then this here is the big section of artists that have made works about the partition of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. That in itself is like a huge thing. So just to give you a real quick walkthrough of the show. And then here, because this space is a little bit larger, I have a whole thing set up of photo books, different photo books about the different partitions. So, India, Bangladesh, this one is Ireland, this one is Mexico, this one is Bosnia, Kill Thy Neighbor. This is another one of Ireland, The Troubles by Chris Steele Perkins, very renowned photographer. This one is by a collective called Active Stills, and they have taken a lot of done protest photography in Palestine. And then lastly, we've got Kashmir. These are 9 photographers who have taken a lot of photos of Kashmir over the years, and then this book is about Native Americans and how, their protest for their lands, which has been partitioned over and over again. So that's a very, very super quick tour of the show. So we're back to the Bosnia section. I wish you guys could have seen it in person. But it's the nature of the show, you know, we're spanning continents. So, and you know, I mean, travel is so 2019. Who does that anymore? We all do Zoom.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you who are Zooming in, and thank you for everyone that's in the audience this evening. I'm Paula Danoff. I'm the president of the Evanston Arts Center, and I'm very excited to have Pritika Chowdhury here with us today to talk about her beautiful curatorial fellowship exhibition and show you some of the work. Are you going to do a tour a little bit, or yeah, okay, good. And we have these wonderful artists that have joined that are in the show. The show's been getting great reviews. Many people are coming in and spending a lot of time. Pritika's done a really nice job of putting a lot of information. So there's a lot of reading and understanding of everything. And so thank you to all of you for being in the show. Thank you to Pritika. And we're very excited to have this wonderful exhibition with us this summer. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So it's sort of a, I'm just, so the artist can see the audience. So I'm sure more people will be trickling in, you know, so it's a hybrid format. So the way it's working is that, you know, I'll be talking to the artists on Zoom, which is being projected here. And then I have some questions for them. We'll be walking around the gallery a little bit, you know, not a lot. Just sort of as the conversation flows. So I have some starter questions is how I always think of my questions, starter questions. So I was thinking that maybe to get our little round robin format started, we could have each one of the artists speak a little bit about themselves, like just introduce yourself. So for example, you know, where are you zooming in from? You know, how long have you been making work? And sort of a favorite quote or just a little detail about your art practice that only you would know, you know, just to sort of let us in the door, so to speak. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Does anybody want to go first?
I go first. That's okay.
Thank you, Sabine.
My name is Sabine Senft. I'm zooming in from sunny San Antonio, Texas. We're probably at 109 degrees right now or something. So talking about borders, I'm about 3 hours from the border here. I grew up about 25 miles from the Iron Curtain Czech border between Czechoslovakia and Germany. So borders have always been in my life. And then I migrated to several other continents and countries. And that has certainly informed my work. So my work is very interdisciplinary. I move between processes, mediums, and materials. So it's research-based, and it's that research, when I dig into the data, that will determine what materials I use. But it's usually sculpture, mixed media, public art, photography, and video. And those are the pieces that we have in the show here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabine. Why don't I quick walk over to your works so people have a little bit of a flavor of which of your works are in the show. So one is this little dynamite piece here. So tell us about it, Sabine.
Yeah, that's titled 4570 GOVT, and that's actually the name of one of the bullets in the piece. So these are all found materials from the Texas-Mexican border. That piece is from 2016. At the time, we had the first huge influx of migration here on the Texas-Mexican border. I came to Texas in 2006. So I dealt with that topic for a few years, and I went down there. I got a research grant from the San Antonio Artist Foundation, and I used that money to take that research trip. I dug up boulders and rocks from the border. So that rock is from down there. I cut them in half, I hand polished them. And I also did a lot of interviews and site visits to follow the paths where the migrants come across the Rio Grande, which is the natural border between Texas and Mexico. And I talked to Border Patrol, park rangers. So like that can lid there, for example, that's in the center of this circle. That is from one of those illegal campsites. And then the bullets, they have just been gathered from friends, family, and been donated to me. And a lot of reference in my work. It stands for the feminine. But it also, that shape with it throws shadows is very, very much referencing the border wall and the border fence right now that's being built.
So these shadows right here. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, so depending on how you set the light, it throws a shadow very similar to what the border fence looks like.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Sabine. So whoever wants to go next, or you can pick the next person.
Hey, I'll pick Leah.
Leah it is.
It's on a boat.
Hi, my name is Leah. I'm from Cyprus. I am a captain of my boat. So I sail around the Mediterranean for a month, mostly in August. So it's my holiday.
You can't hear?
You send us 5 questions.
Yes.
And I try to answer the 5th one, and I would like to start as an introduction with the answer of the 5th one, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So the 5th question here, which we all have to answer, I guess, and it's like a dialogue between all of us.
Yes.
Is what are your thoughts about the comparative discourse of partitions, where we juxtapose the partitions of Palestine, Bosnia, India, Pakistan, Cyprus, Germany, Mexico, and Native America? So I try to answer this with the rest of us on the panel from different countries. And I would describe the Cyprus similar to Ukraine today, in which an outside force, Russia, with the excuse of protecting a minority, the Russian minority in Ukraine, invades, takes an area, and displaces its inhabitants, i.e. the Ukrainians. The Russian minorities, under so-called protection, now live in an open border as part of Russia. They have self-declared themselves as independent state, like Northern Cyprus, and then their union with Russia. I'm referring to the Russia-occupied territories of Ukraine, its Crimea, parts of Luhansk Oblast, apologize for my accent, and Donetsk Oblast, which was in 2014, and in 2020.
Excuse
yes.
me. So this first round is just for a quick introduction, if you don't mind.
But I thought it would, okay.
Yeah, because we still haven't, done the introduction. We'll dive deeper into each of the questions after the introduction. We'll go one question by one question. So sorry.
Well, that's my introduction.
Yeah, okay. So if you can just tell us a little bit about your practice. So you have an extensive practice, right? Like it spans different media, installations, performance. So this is where you want to just give us a little insight into who you are as an artist, Like who's Leah, the artist? And I saw the documentary fully, so I know, but for those who don't, or have not,
that one.
I wouldn't say I know, I have an idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
You see, I usually like my work to speak for itself.
Yeah.
I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I'll be 60 this year, which is like, so I've been doing a lot of political work, which I hope it's not propaganda, it depends how you see it, but definitely not.
Yeah.
I try to be more poetic with a lot of humor, sarcasm. It's the British colony. Maybe that's why I have this black humor in me. We had a lot of Irish in Cyprus. That's who they taught us how to fight for independence. And so we're fighters with black humor.
Yeah.
That's it.
Nice. Very nice. Thank you, Leah.
Next then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you pick the next person.
Ireland.
Okay.
Me?
Yep.
Ireland. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, hi everybody. My name's Gail Ritchie, and I'm sorry it's so dark in the room. I've lots of lights, but this is summer in Ireland, so hey, what can you do? So I'm an artist based in a group studio in Belfast, in East Belfast, which is very much a socially and economically deprived area of the city.
It's
Probably seen as loyalist and with a lot of paramilitary activities, but there's 50 artists there in the building, and we think it's fine so far. So the work that I have in the exhibition is 2 pieces, which are the result of just last year I finished doing a practice-based PhD, which I did as an artist whose work has always looked at conflict that I had experienced and lived through, which was the Troubles. And I was questioning myself really, well, why is that? And I realized it was because a lot of people here, there are such dominant narratives on either side of the conflict that a lot of people like me, who equally experienced it and lived through those times, feel somehow, well, what can I say? How can I compete against those 2 very dominant narratives? And so this PhD was an opportunity for me to really reflect in a sustained way through my memories of the Troubles, and to think about how the Troubles might be commemorated. Not to say they should be, but if they were to be, how might that be? So there's a whole expansive work of which these are only 2 parts. And as we'll touch on later in the conversation when we're talking about borders and partitions, that how that replicates through Northern Ireland society in so many ways. And so throughout all of my work as an artist, there's almost this built-in ambiguity and the refusal to take sides. And you can see that in maybe the neutral palette of the work. And so that's me, really, an artist who's very much involved in themes of conflict, memory, and memorial.
awesome. Awesome, Gail. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So you get to pick the next person.
Nadine?
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadine Nasher. I'm a photographer and translator from Palestine, but I'm calling in today from Philadelphia, where I'm doing my master's in architecture. And something about my practice, I'm a very much square photographer. I work with medium format and large format film photography most of the time.
Mhm.
And my works in the exhibition are that.
Yeah, that is correct. And let me go quick and show everybody the works. So Nadine's photographs are fairly large prints, and they are, one is this, and this is Nadine, correct my pronunciation, Masdoud number 4.
Yeah. Yes, this is from a series called Masnood.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And then this one is a few questions on disintegrated memories and their remains. This is the first in that series. And then the third one, we sort of put it in the window because it was so big, we couldn't fit it anywhere else, but it brought us a lot of foot traffic. So it's this one. And we all know that this is not just a picture of a palm tree. So, but this is the This is another very powerful work here. So,
Yeah, this is also from this dude.
yeah, and that is the Mastood number 1, correct? That was?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Nadine. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and you get to pick the next person.
Anag, I think. I don't know.
Yes. Hello, my name is Anak Banerjee. I'm an artist and printmaker essentially from Bombay, India, but I'm currently based in New York, and I'm zooming in from New York City. My work involves documenting the partition of the Indian subcontinent and basically trying to represent the human dimension, the human stories from partition, and to balance out the political narrative, which is so aggressively positioned as the only narrative about the partition. It has involved so far interviewing first-hand accounts, interviewing people who went through partition, starting with my grandmother in 47, 48, and building up an archive of first-hand accounts of the partition, of stories of displacement, and there's a lot of amazing scholarship that has emerged in this space. But as a visual artist, I feel like that is something that probably there isn't as much of compared to literature and film and other forms of art. So this is what I would like my contribution to be in terms of memorializing the partition of the Indian subcontinent.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot that could be done through the visual arts. It's undertapped. It's undertapped in terms of the memorialization discourse in partition studies. But yes, thank you, Anag. So there's our introduction. Let's jump right into our first question. So our first question is, how does your practice engage with the idea of partition, intergenerational trauma, and memorialization? So just for the audience, the question is, how does your practice engage with the idea of partitions, intergenerational trauma, and memorialization? So now you get to pick the next person.
Gail?
Yeah.
Me? Well, I mean, the partition of Ireland in 1921, it wasn't just a geographical division. It's something that still perpetuates down today and has resulted in what, so many binaries of nearly everything in our society. And I think my work really is a reaction against all of those binaries, because I've always just never subscribed to them, really. So it's not just the north, the south. It's the whole us-them mentality, Protestant, Catholic, unionist, nationalist, loyalist, these kind of things, even victim perpetrator during the recent Troubles, for example. So on each side of that divide, if you like, would have its own rituals and emblems and symbols and traditions. So even when you're born into that society, you have no choice, because your name denotes immediately what side of that divide you're from, and you can't get away from it, because schools are partitioned as well. And
I see.
growing up with that, yeah, and in the most recent work, I rather than trying to address either of those partitions, I decided I was going to work right in between them, in that space that exists between two things that I'm not, if you like, and see how far they could be pushed apart. Because for me, there's always this third way in Northern Ireland, it's always us and them, us and them. And I thought, well, what about if there's an unknown other in the widest sense that the other could be? Who is this other? I've always felt other. So the work that I was making could be, yes, for us and them, but it's in that gap in between those two things to always be inclusive of this unknown other, which in a very binary society is only now the two dominant political parties, if you like, are slowly being challenged by these upcoming others who also don't describe to those binaries.
Wonderful.
I mean, I can go on to the other two bits of the question, or just stop at that bit, maybe.
No, go on, please.
Well, as I said, in order for me to operate between those binaries, then you have to move into pluralities and multiplicities of things. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, the past is contested, what happened in the past is contested, and how the past is remembered is contested. But if you take the position that there are multiple versions of the past, there's multiple realities, and there's multiple potential futures. I mean, I got really into things like quantum physics and anything that I could kind of hang on to shift me away from these political binaries and a refusal to take sides. So intergenerational trauma is certainly a thing that exists here. It's maybe more a thing in those areas which have been socially and economically deprived. In more middle class areas, it's maybe less of a thing. But for me, when I was making this work about the Troubles and reflecting back, I didn't want to take anybody else's trauma or anybody else's memory and make work from that, because that for me, that's not my place to do that. I lived through the Troubles, I experienced them, and I have my own memories, and so very much for the first time probably, those are the things that I wanted to draw on. But within that, then not making them explicit, but trying to make them more universal and more ambiguous, because I didn't want to get into victim, perpetrator, us, them. So I guess in the round, that's how I would always address all of those things, by somehow trying to be the other and bring less binary notions or fixed notions of identity to the work that I make.
That is so very interesting. And, I think at this point, please, everybody, if you see a thread that you want to pick up and talk about, please jump in. I think I wanted to jump in, but I'm going to refrain myself, because I want to hear from you guys. You brought up some very good points, Gail. Those polarizations, and I think the witnessing of trauma yourself, primary witness, and as a secondary witness, when you hear about it from other people, or you see documentation of it, or whatever it is, there are two different positions. They're two very different positions. Yeah.
I mean, there's almost a sense here that the arts, there's a lot of funding for the arts to go into communities and work with them. And for me, it's a bit problematic sometimes, even as part of a funded organization. Sometimes you're asked directly the question, for example, what is your organization going to do for suicide prevention or something like that? And I've actually written the response, we are not qualified to do that. We're not, qualified therapists, we're not qualified trauma counselors, but there's this expectation here sometimes that, the arts, throw an arts organization in there, get an artist to work with this community, they'll all feel better. And I've given talks at those communities, and that's why I draw my own memories, because there's something a bit magpie-like of going in and taking the glittery bits of somebody else's lived experience and making artwork from it. So that's why I keep trying to bring it back to myself, and then put that out there and see if that's how that's received by everybody else.
Great point. Nadine, you want to jump in on this? And Nadine and Anag specifically? Because, you know, there is the generation that receives these memories, right? And so our location by default is one where we are operating with our ancestors' memories, other people's memories. So how do you guys feel about this?
I think, Nadeem,
This
you want to go?
question, this whole question.
Yeah. I think the one thing that is fundamental, I feel, to all partitions, which I'm sure all of us would agree with, is there being these binary narratives of such events. I mean, within partition of partition studies in the subcontinent, you are either the existing documentation of the partition for in all these years has been either oh, this was my homeland and of my ancestors, almost like a mythical place across the border where everything was happy and everything was harmonious, and then something happened and we don't live there anymore, and I long for my brothers and sisters across the border, which is absolutely, I mean, very, very real. But also there is the other end of the other binary, which is that we were wronged. And so there is that, so therefore prejudices and biases exist, and we continue to hate them and they continue to hate us. And what because I spoke to so many people, and I feel like there's so much more nuance to this apart from these two. I mean, they need to be held together and acknowledged, I think, and there are so many voices that get missed out and or don't find representation because we continue to reinforce these narratives. And also in terms of intergenerational trauma, I think it is something that I feel and is very real, but I don't have the language to talk about it. Because when my grandmother first told me about her experience, she got married and she came to what is now India from what was then East Pakistan. And then she couldn't go back and see her parents for 14 years after that. And she said it in a very matter of fact kind of a way. So this happened. So I feel like there is, and because they had to start life from zero and raise a family and so on, maybe they did not have the space to grieve. And so I don't really know. I don't know what I'm saying. It's maybe me projecting what I think they must have gone through. And also the other thing in my life, which in this context, when I'm working on the project, I try to derive from is no matter how much I get used to being in New York, every time I go home and come back, I do feel a sense of displacement and almost like an exile of sorts. I mean, I'm not at all comparing the two experiences. I mean, it would be very rich of me to say that these are similar experiences, but I mean, I try to put myself in those shoes and try to understand what it must have been through the lens of me being away from home. That is one component of the intergenerational baggage that I engage with, and also the relationships between Bangladesh and India are still better than India and Pakistan. So we have been able to travel to Bangladesh. We have been there, and we see the same people with the same habits and same culture, and also living this conflicted identity as to who they are, where they come from. even on the border. This, I think, is something very unique, even within the Indian subcontinent, to the eastern side of the border, which is between India and Bangladesh, is because there are a lot of water bodies, there are a lot of marshlands, and the line was drawn very arbitrarily. So even today, there are households on the partition line in which the kitchen is in India and the living room is in Bangladesh, technically. So I don't know how they live with it. Maybe they don't care. I don't know. But these are things that inform the work that I do, and also the way I think about intergenerational exchange and the conflicted identities. Yeah, I don't know if any of this is making sense, but I think this is just because intergenerational traumas, I think it's quite visceral. I don't really have language to talk about it. Does that make sense? Does any of this make sense?
It does. Actually, it totally does. Nadine?
Yeah, I would say that in my work, I don't set out working under these specific topics or these specific titles, but then in reflection afterwards, where I would say that these things come up is when I'm dealing with things like memory or traces of memory. Because I grew up in a family where we didn't really talk about the Nakba of 1948. I did not learn from my grandparents what happened to them and what their stories were. And this was a kind of like a way of living that my parents passed down, which is their generation was very much a generation of trying to fit in as much as possible and not get into trouble, because trouble meant that it could have meant stopping your life at any point. And I think this is something that they lived through, that they try to pass down onto us. And then the second thing is that for my nuclear family specifically, we did not grow up in our original hometown. So most Palestinian families for generations, for hundreds and hundreds of years, they can live and grow in the same place. But my parents made the decision to move for their work, for their studies, for our futures. So we did not grow up in that nucleus, and or the bigger family, our cousins and our uncles and our great uncles and aunts. So these are people who were not actively part of our daily life. So when I set out to do work, this is the kind of baggage that's in the background. When I do something like this, integrated memories, I'm looking at the landscape around me, and I'm thinking about all the names and words of places that I did not learn, not only because my family specifically does not talk about these topics, or for many, many years could not talk. I think I should say could not rather than does not or will not, because when you go through something like that, I think it becomes less of a choice of how you deal with it. So it's not just their personal experience, but it's also a policy that surrounds us. Our country is occupied, and the names of the places that are all around us are being Hebraicized or Israelicized. So all the Arabic names are erased, and everything else they're being replaced with Hebrew words. So you don't grow up with this very integral knowledge of looking at the world around you and knowing how to call it in your language. And I think all of these together created in me these gaps and these, again, like this integrated pieces that I'm trying to fit together eventually through the work. Not directly by saying the partition or this is what is happening in my work, but rather through thinking about the personal experience and then trying to work out the personal side of it and my personal lens of existing in these spaces.
Thank you, Nadine. That's really insightful. I think inherited memories and inherited silences can become very, very productive spaces in some ways, if one can channel them. If not, they can become very troubling things in our minds. Sabine, I want to hear from you too about this, because you've done some work specifically on sort of the processes of how memory functions, right? Do you want to
Yeah.
tell us a bit about that?
And it's been in my work for years. And one thread I'm picking up here between all of us is that there's like this unconscious, very subconscious thread in our lives. Although we come from completely different regions, the effects are very, very similar. That feeling of uprootedness, that need to migrate, that need to either freeze and stay in place for parts of the family. That was my family, very much so. Silence after World War II. That was how their coping mechanism. They didn't talk about it. They didn't have psychological help, counseling or anything. So they chose silence as a coping mechanism. And then there's my generation, and I move around. I'm a migrant here. My children were not even born in this country, so they're technically still migrants. And so this seems to, it's very interesting for me to observe that now, that ties us all together. So when I started drawing parallels between border living in how I grew up in Germany after World War II and the local border here, that psychological aspect was not even on my mind. It was about the suffering and just to make it conscious that history is repeating itself, because I was in a position to observe things that are repeating themselves. So that was my point back then. And over the years of dealing with that topic, I came into that psychological aspect of it, that intergenerational trauma, exactly like Anak said, like I was observing what my parents did and wondering, well, how has it affected me? Their silence, what did their silence individually and collectively as a nation cause in me, my work, my family? What am I passing on? And I think Germany has actually done a lot of good work processing and dealing with memorialization. I think they really worked hard on that. Whereas I see a lot of other countries simply, they're just still in denial. And trauma does not get processed by denial. That is, I dug very, very deeply into the neurobiology of this. And I spent 2 or 3 years now studying how intergenerational transfer of trauma, how it affects your brain chemistry. And it actually, trauma can override your epigenetics, and it will do that. And it will subconsciously invade your behavior patterns, how you process things and what you pass on. And that is so, so powerful that people become aware of that, because that is where we as individuals and as a society can actually break that cycle. So we can break the silence. We can not pass on certain learned habits to our children. And that is a huge chance for us. And that is where the arts can come in. And that is where my art now comes in, to simply provide a space and get people think about it, create a space for reflection, maybe nudge them into a new perspective. And so that is where, all that work on neuroscience, neurobiology came in. And then, so that is where the one piece in your show, the Aufarbeitung, which is the German word for processing, that is very much on that work. So I started that last year in Berlin, that whole series. I was fortunate enough to have a residency there. And if you want to walk over there, I'm happy to talk about it some more.
I just realized I should do that.
So Aufarbeitung is the term for processing. And in Germany, it's often referred to as processing Germany's past and role in the Holocaust, of course, and the partitioning into East and West in the aftermath. And so the whole installation here is based on neurobiological research of myelin. And myelin is the brain's fatty coating of neurons. And brain patterning can be used as a method to heal the impact of trauma. That's why this matters. And so again, going back to those epigenetic tags that can be overwritten by trauma. So we are all kind of functioning on an autopilot of our ancestral generations, unless we tackle that and work with it. So
that is so profound. I feel like just being on autopilot of inherited trauma.
That was for me one of those key phrases that suddenly, while I was working, it popped into my head. And I thought, this is so true, though, because unless we become aware, that's exactly what we're doing. And the subtitle for this piece is, it's Aufarbeitung, one thing led to another. And in history and in personal life, dramatic changes, they do not happen overnight. If you pay attention, the red flags are always there. They're there before a country doesn't get divided overnight. There's a run up to it. There's people ignoring, people choosing to ignore, or a minority putting up a resistance in case of partition, but people don't want to see the red flags. And they have to break that cycle, because otherwise we keep doing the same thing and we will repeat history and we will pass that trauma on. And so for me, that whole, like the myelin, the brain tissue, that just came in as a very tangible idea, because in the run up to that show, I actually had a seizure and a stroke last year. So I used my own brain scans as the starting point for that, of the trauma. And I was in Berlin. I was confronted with childhood memories on the side of the wall. And I thought, let's do this here and now. So I threw all my plan for the residency out of the window, said, let's tackle that. I work with childhood materials, that cotton texture, that comes actually from a childhood home. My parents used to own a shop where they would sell that.
Oh my gosh.
That is where that came. Wow. And the original piece was actually, it's wall filling, Arbeitung 1, and that's actually the shape of a brain. It's still in progress. And with those, so that's where that pattern came from. And then the projection over it, these dreamlike images of healing, that which was very, very personally for me at the time. I was healing my brain when I made that work, but also healing as a country, the collective healing. And so, yeah, that is what all my work is about, to create a space where that healing can happen, to, even if people don't want to engage with the depth of each work, my work is very much on different levels, that they at least watching the work can step back, get that bit of reflection zone. And if they want to dive deeper, they can. They don't have to. And a lot of times when we are in that PTSD trauma state, we can't deal with it. We just can't.
Yeah.
But it's the first step, and it's there. And that's the space I offer. That's my contribution here.
Thank you, Sabine. That's really so wonderful to hear that. Leah, what is your take on this? The obviously, so the partition of Cyprus, or occupation of the northern part of Cyprus, happened in 1974, right? Were you born then? No, you were not born then.
I was 11.
You were 11. Oh, so you remember it?
Yeah, Sabine, that was fascinating what you just said. That was a really fascinating project. Nice, interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. I tried to tackle your question.
Yes, please.
Your question number 3. Do the concepts of post memory?
We are on 1. We are still on 1.
We're on 1. Well, I thought we were on the anti-memorials and memorials.
Well, they're very connected. They're very connected.
So
we can go on to that. Go ahead.
I tried to tackle the post-memory anti-memorials.
Sure.
And think about anti-memorials and memorials and monuments. And I wrote some notes on monuments of human right violations from your notes when I Googled you and everything, about the atrocities that should be projected into a monument or not, and whether we do all this. And what came to mind is the most interesting monument I have seen in Cyprus so far is a monument which is a UN container, a trailer. It's an old communication center, which is a monument of collapsed endeavors. It's by the Security Council. The Security Council, meaning the great powers of the world that make up the Security Council, they take a number of decisions for immediate action, which everybody has to do, and none are followed. So this monument is the UN trailer, which is checking the borders. And underneath is the thousands Security Council telling us what actions to be taken. Nobody's taking them. And it's a monument which I find fascinating because there's some pure humor and irony to it, and it's not preachy, and it's not, it's there and it's not there. It's just interesting. And this is my take on how I work also. I try not to be preachy. I try not to project any victimhood or trauma. I try to be as factual as possible, very cerebral. Yes,
Yes.
the hard out.
Yep.
That's why I found Sabine so fascinating. I love my other half there. So, and there you have the art piece that I am projecting with you. Is my son. He's kind of my age, in 74.
Yeah.
He's in the 4th grade. He's okay, he's 10, I was 11. And he's writing in one of these books, they're textbooks which are given at schools, Greek Cypriot schools, do not forget. And he's been punished after school writing, I have to love my neighbor. I have to love my neighbor. I have to love my neighbor. I have to love my neighbor, which is what we basically do have to love, but we have to love it. But he's punished as laughter at this small young age, which has no idea what we're all talking about. And that's it. It's got the same irony as that monument of all these great powers sitting there telling us what we have to do and we should be doing. Nobody's doing it. And there you are again there. Okay, that's it.
So the neighbor there, I actually wanted to ask that question, Leah.
Be any of your neighbors, your neighbors, my neighbors, are not just border neighbors, living together in peace, all of us.
So could that also
Not building walls, but
No,
taking the
that-
walls down, neighborhood walls, borders.
could that also mean that the Turkish occupiers in the north? That
Of course, your
Yeah.
neighbors. And yes, and your Irish neighbors, your Bosnian neighbors, your neighbors.
okay,
You're our neighbors. Gotta
interesting.
learn to live with each other, whether
Interesting.
we want it or not. This is it. We're all foreigners. We've got to make space for each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So we're a little bit into the second question where some of you have shared sort of your personal connection to, or your family's connection to the partition event, so to speak. So Leah, you mentioned you were 11 and you were in Cyprus when it all went down, like you witnessed it.
Yes, of course. Yes.
And Gail, you mentioned that you were part of the time when the troubles were happening, which is so crazy to think of.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember a time when they weren't part of my life, and so and I've reflected that this is maybe why I never made artwork about it, because when something maybe is your normality and your everyday, and you're so accepting of that, when you get to art college and you know, you want to make different stuff. So
Yeah.
for example, where my grandmother lived, every Saturday we would go to her house, and there's just, you know, soldiers everywhere and Land Rovers and things like that. Right through to when I was in my 20s and driving a motorbike, you know, and you'd maybe stop at traffic lights and there's a lamp in front of you with the soldiers kind of scoping you down his gun, and you're just sitting there waiting for the lights to change, you know, not really thinking. It's crazy, you know. But that, or you're in a shop and the alarms go off and they're saying bomb scare, get out, and people are going, yeah, well, you know, I just want to try this coat on here just a second. And it's so normalized that it's only 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement when you reflect back on your life and you think that was crazy. That was crazy, but you just accepted it. Because everybody was going through the same thing at the same time. And yeah, just the I mean, it was a 30-year conflict, so it lasted, you know, quite a long time.
Yeah.
Become so accepting of that is strange, but you don't see that when you're in the middle of it. I sort of lost my point there because I went off down memory road, but
No,
yeah.
the point simply was that in question 2 was like, what is our personal connection or our families or communities' connection to the partition event. And you,
Oh yeah, well, I did
legal-
want to say, yeah, I did want to make a point that so although my family were directly involved in partition, my great-grandfather all served at different lengths and different capacities for the British security forces. And so me, the last of that line, if you like, there's a very famous poem by Seamus Heaney called Digging, where he's a poet, but his forebears worked the land. And he's writing a poem with his pen, and he's looking down into the garden as his father is digging, and he thinks back to his grandfather digging the sod, and thinks that the pen is in his hand, snug as a gun, but that's his tool, that's his weapon, that's how he will dig. And that really resonates with me, because I thought, well, I'm the last of that line, a female, I'm an artist, and I'm having to reflect back on their service, some of which is difficult as you go through archives and read things. But also then the other side of that is, what were all the women partners of all those males doing who were involved? And again, that brings us back to silences and what wasn't said, and also normalcy, where the woman's role was maybe the man was off doing something in uniform, and the woman's role was trying to keep things normal for the kids. And of course, during the Troubles, you could never say what your father was doing, but I remember thinking when I was a teenager, gosh, Dad's really fussy about the car, you know. And then it was my elder sister said to me, to use a colloquialism, wise up, you know, what do you think he's doing? And of course he was like checking underneath the car for bombs and things like that, which you just didn't think of because you're being a teenager and doing your thing. And the sort of tensions then that brings into the domestic sphere that your mother's trying to dissipate. So there's different levels of involvement going back through Northern Irish history, which will probably bring us, you know, back to the gendered question. But again, it also brings us maybe back to binaries in terms of what the roles and divisions were within the conflict, or within partition.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Thank you, Gail. And I know, Nadine, you mentioned that your grandparents went through the 1948 Nakba. Did the 1967 Nakba also impact your family?
I mean, like all other Palestinians, both events impacted the family, and for us, we Palestinians say that the Nakba is ongoing. It's not something that started and ended in 1948, because there are still attempts to expel us from our lands, and well, the way it is today is that we are now divided into almost tiers of citizenship. Whereas if you won the lottery and you were born and you were not expelled in 1948, you are an Israeli citizen. So you are relatively secure in status, unless you do something that's not acceptable. And then there are Palestinians who have become residents in their own land, which is conditional, and they can be kicked out at any point. And then there are Palestinians who are, you know, the lowest tier. I say this sarcastically, who are not citizens of Israel and not residents of Israel, and they are Palestinians who are living in Gaza or the West Bank. So yes, my family was impacted by both events directly or indirectly, and I would say my generation is still impacted and living through these events, even though I am in a relatively privileged position where I guess my status is secure. But like Gail, we also lived through this time period where you don't know where it's going to come from. You know, like I have memories of my childhood where we're running through the shopping mall because of a bomb scare, even though nothing happened in the end, but it's just part of a panic herd where suddenly everyone is running to the exit. Or, you know, you're just sitting on a bus and watching for any suspicious objects, or you're trying to not be the suspicious object in a given space. And then in more recent years, as things have escalated, again, trying not to be the suspicious object, like trying not to be visible or present, which is hard for someone like me because I do not look white. And so like we do still have these, I still have these experiences that fluctuate, of suddenly being afraid to talk in Arabic in spaces where it's mainly Jewish Israelis around me, because you feel these tensions are rising and rising constantly, all the time. And my grandparents' generation, they were obviously, I don't know the full stories because no one wanted to tell them, but they were, on my grandmother's side, they were expelled from their original land. They were landowners, and this meant that they lost most of their lands. Even their house still existed, was taken over by a Jewish Israeli family. And my grandmother went to visit it at some point, and she had to knock on the door and ask for permission to see the house. The house still exists. My grandfather on my mother's side, he got stuck beyond the Green Line from 1948 until the 70s. He was a child studying in a town called Tulkarem, which was, it had the good school. He was sent there as a boy to study. He's the eldest of his siblings. And then the war happened and he got stuck there. And because he was not in the population count, he was not counted as a citizen or as a person who can become a citizen. And then until around 76, he did not see his families. And in the meantime, he got married, he had children, he had my mother among his children. They traveled all over the Arab world. They ended up in Saudi Arabia, where he was working. And then finally, somehow they managed to get family reunification, which is also an anomaly because it's not something that Palestinians get to this day. And they managed to come back. But for him, this experience of coming back and seeing how his world had changed was so difficult that he ultimately could not accept the Israeli citizenship. And he decided to not go back to his original hometown where all of his extended family is. And he decided instead to settle in Jerusalem and to accept the status as a Jerusalem resident, which is not a citizen, but rather a conditional status where if you do leave the city, you could lose your status and never be able to come back. And come back and stay in Palestine. And that's the status that my mother and her siblings were born into. And she retained that status until she got married to my father. But even then, they could not get the so-called family reunification, and she could not get the citizenship, and they had to take their case to the high court in my name and in my siblings' name to demand citizenship for her. So it's not a process that ended. It's like an entire system, or entire systems that are always active, whether it's physical violence, whether it's emotional violence, whether it's linguistic violence or spatial violence. It's something that surrounds you all the time.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all that with us, Nadine. I apologize for my very naive question there. Obviously, lived reality is always so much more denser than what one can perceive from at a distance, going back to what Gail was saying. Sabine, you want to tell us a little bit about what was that brush with that event in Germany of the partition? Was it the partition of Germany that was the event?
What it goes back to, yes, for sure. Because again, it's that normalization, you grow up with it. Like I was born after World War II, obviously. My mother was born towards the end of it. My father was drafted when he was 17. He was in the war, and he was marched as a teenager to Italy to fight there on the border, arrested by, I think it was the British military, and then walked back home. And he spoke a little about these things, but it was obviously highly traumatizing, and then that was just his way of coping. Whereas on my mother's side, so to go step back a bit, where I grew up in a tiny rural village, literally like less than 25 miles from the Iron Curtain. So my mother was born in the area, but back then there was no border. I grew up with knowing that area, but my world ended. There was simply a fence there. That was just how it was, and we were used to that. There were watchtowers there, there were snipers on it, and that is how we grew up. It was normal to watch the Sunday evening news, and you would see that someone tried to flee the east and climb over, either in Berlin over the wall or anywhere else in the Iron Curtain, and every now and then you would get in the news that someone was shot there. That was just the normal reality in the 70s there, that you just grow up with that. And then it took until my mid-40s to realize that a lot of things, events in my life, they played out, or certain, again, I think it's that intergenerational trauma is because we never knew the female line of our family. My mother was born across what is now the border. She was put into an orphanage because of that, well, call it ethnic cleansing, if you will, because she was of the ancestry that was not welcome there. So they took her and put her into an orphanage. So she was in there for a year until she was adopted by Westerners. And you normalize it that you don't know your grandparents, that you don't have one line of the family. It's just not available. And I never questioned that. And then as I grow up and I see families gathering and they have all these siblings, they have all these cousins, it dawned on me like, yeah, I don't have any of that. And it's not because I left Germany, because even if I go back there, they're not there, because there was a war, there was a partition, and you couldn't go over there. You could get a day visa at the time, and we did that occasionally to visit, because art materials and books were a lot cheaper in the Eastern blocks. So, but you had to pay your day visa, and it was a highly, it was a fearful experience to walk over there as a teenager and under machine gun watch. And my mom went back when she was in her 70s to find traces of her mom. We had her name. That's all we have from the family. We have her mother's name. And she found it in some church records. And that is where the ancestry line stops. That's as good as it gets. And you never question that until you get older, until you self-reflect and become aware of those mechanisms. So yeah, so I'm missing the whole female line, the whole feminine side of that. And I think that was also part in my own autobiography, where I was a total tomboy until my 30s. And I think it harks back to that. And again, I think these individual stories are the way to tell it, because that is, when we pass that on as artists, that is what makes people feel it viscerally, rather than reading it in a book. Oh yes, there was a partition in Cyprus. Yes, there was a partition in India. It's abstract, but if you tell your own story, you can touch people.
Exactly.
And that's our job.
Yeah. Thank you, Sabine. That's powerful. And Anag, you mentioned that your the partition event was actually experienced by your grandmother, who came over after she was married, right? And then you long for your cousins over the border. Tell us a little, just give us a little bit more about your experience there. Oh, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, I still remember the conversation very vividly with her. And like I said, it was a very matter of fact kind of a, recollection of a fact that, we came over and I couldn't go back home for 14 years. And in that time, when she did go back, her father was no more, and her siblings were very young when she had moved. So when she went back, they couldn't recognize her. So there was always this very.
They couldn't recognize her.
Yeah, where they would just wait for letters. It's also a very different world. I mean, it's difficult to imagine now, but they would. So the communication in those 14 years must have been very little.
Yeah.
So that was their story, but also like going back to the first question of what what constitutes the idea of the partition when there are these very fixed narratives of it being a geopolitical event that took place, and the bloodshed and the violence. but there is so much more when you zoom into the individual story. Like it's just a thought, like you know how the especially with Punjab, the bloodshed is often brought up, and the trains are like a symbol of the massacre that happened. Bodies full of the train full of bodies going from one way or another. And I often think, what would the story of the man who was driving that train be? Or those trains were scrubbed clean of all violence. The people who worked on those trains to clean those trains, what would their story have been? I mean, I'm sure these are perspectives that don't exist anywhere, but would add so much more to the human story of the partition. And also, I think like in the interviews that I have when I've spoken to different people, there's been a loss of such different nature. Like I remember speaking to my music teacher when he and his family moved from Karachi to Amritsar and then Bombay. He was a 5-year-old then, and he remembers reading out the names of the stations when they were traveling in the train, and almost like showing off to his family, like, look, I can spell. You know, like he would spell out the names of the trains in those Arabic characters, and he just never spoke that language again. So his sense of loss is very heavily based on a loss of culture, loss of a certain kind of sound, a loss of a language. Then, yeah. So I mean, the individual story has so much to add and add to this story of the partition. I mean, like, I don't know. I'm really curious. It's really intriguing, right? The people, the fishermen and fisherwomen on the Bangladesh border. What would their idea of home be? Like, do I go to work to India every day and come back? Or like, what is it? So these are very nuanced, gray things, and it does. Not having these stories does a complete disservice, I think, to such a monumental episode, and how that continues to shape the identity in the subcontinent, especially when in the populist kind of governance that we have, where you are like sort of reframing narratives or reframing what it means to be Indian or Pakistani, or what is I and us and them, and the othering keeps happening, but without there being nuance to the stories, to the story of the partition. So we keep seeing partition every day. It's just that same narrative of
thank you, Anand. That's so amazing. I mean, just in this conversation, I feel like I am now beginning to hear similar stories, you know, like what Gail was saying, you know, the polarities, you know, we have that in India. I mean, the Hindus and Muslims are, you know, forever at odds, and now, and I mean, I'm like Gail, I refuse to take sides, you know, so a lot of my Hindu friends feel like I'm pro-Muslim, and it's just that, no, I'm just anti-bigotry, you know. So Leah, not to forget what you said about you being 11 when that partition of Cyprus happened. Were you in the southern side of Cyprus? I mean, I'm assuming, but you probably were not, or you were. You were.
No, in my family, we have been twice refugees.
Oh.
Once in the population exchange with Turkey and Greece in the 1920s,
Yeah.
and again in 74. So twice refugees, it's the story of our life. And you find it a lot in many Greek Cypriot families, this being twice a refugee, twice rebuilding your life. But I always look, as you've seen in my film, towards the future. And I'm making a new art piece now called Best Look West. And it has to do with the melancholy of my geography in Cyprus. So if you look north, it's occupied, Turkey. Twice refugees, you don't want to mess around with the third time refugee. If you look east, it's unrest. It's Syria, it's Lebanon, the refugees flooding in, completely unrest. Better partition than Syria, Lebanon, what's going on there? If you look south, Libya, completely unstable. So this geography of the melancholy of where Cyprus is situated, this geography, is the best thing you can do is you have to look west, whether you like it or not. Like most of you have migrated into Western countries, unfortunately. And West for us is an aging continent, and you'll see in there. So, and we're brown, we're minorities, we have everything you talk about. My Palestine friend here, I'm also brown, you don't know what to say, where to go, whatever. But West, unfortunately or fortunately, it seems like the only solution. Geographic melancholia, this is where
Geographic.
I am right now.
Amazing. That's that's the first time I've heard that phrase. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us.
I'm running out of battery, so excuse me for a minute.
Yes. So I'm gonna move us to the fourth and fifth question here, and they may overlap. I don't know. So and we touched on this already. So the issue of gender, you know, I found it curious that in all these partitions that I studied, gender was a real sore topic, you know, like it was the women were targeted in a way in this sort of ethnic communal violence and partitions and fissures. There was a commonality to that. You know, there was a commonality to that. And I just wanted to bring it up with you guys to see if what was your experience? Like, what was your experience? The open-ended question. And what is your thoughts about it? Don't make me put somebody on the spot.
I don't know. I mean, I start off. I mean, I was thinking about that question a lot, and to me, in history, the spotlight has always been on the men, at least in my background. And you know, all the monuments, they go to the men. But then, when you listen to who held up the countries when the partition happened, who did the work, who did the rebuilding, well, guess what? The men were not there. It was the women. The women held up the fort, and in the family, they kept the family, the community together. And they also went to work and built ammunition and airplanes. So I always feel like the burden of the work has always fallen on the women, and yet they do not get the credits. They don't even get the credit for being the rape victims either. I mean, like going back to Berlin, when Germany was divided into the sections, the British, the French, the Russian section, there was, I think, a 30% birth rate of Russian children being born in Berlin, and they were all rape children from the invasion there. And again, it was the silence. It's just like you live with that DNA in you, because that was the only way they could do. But I have not seen a memorial to those raped women.
No, that
so
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I did not know that. I did not know that statistic. I had read that.
Only on the 30%, but it was horrendously. There's some books out there that I read, and I would have to look it up exactly, but it was a horrifically high rate. And that is still, that is what war, that is what patriarchy uses to dominate another culture, is to rape the women.
Yeah.
And to this day.
Wow. Yeah, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. So anybody wants to pick up that topic in the context of the partition that they experienced or studied or researched or whatever, please feel free to.
Yeah, my understanding has been from the research that I have done. Urvashi Butalia is someone who has extensively worked with the women's voices in the partition, and it is shocking, the numbers firstly, and also things like both countries sent search parties to each other to reclaim our women. So some of the things that I mean, the gender violence that happened during the partition is just yeah, and there is absolutely no platform that has given represents these voices, and also yeah, absolutely no sort of memorial that even I can think of to the rape victims.
Yeah, you know, and that's just the 1947 one. The 1971 partition was even worse in terms of the gender violence, right? The one that created Bangladesh, over what the rough figures, you know, conservative estimates of 200,000, 400,000 women were targeted by the Pakistani army. And the same issue, Sabine, that the children born out of those rapes, you know, that's a complex issue of unbelonging, you know, like where do they go? And oftentimes they end up in orphanages, you know, but oftentimes they just become.
Carry that forward. That's the other thing. You carry that, not just the trauma, but you literally carry the DNA forward. So instead of mixing and then, you know, doing that voluntarily, it's just forced upon you, and you're left to deal with it. And you might never know that that's what it is. Like I did one of those 23 DNA tests, and I was totally surprised to find, like, I thought it would be 100% French German. I have over 30, almost 40% Russian, Polish, something over there in there. So I'm sure that's how I got in there.
Wow.
And
wow.
We're just scratching the surface of finding out these things through technology, through modern means.
Yeah.
And yeah, like in my case, I can't even go back and ask or research because there's a border there. It doesn't work. But we carry that in us. We carry the trauma. We carry the DNA. We carry that forward, and we have to deal with it, because if you don't deal with it, you pass it on.
Yeah. No, Leah,
especially the women. And again, you fall to the women, you know, that's.
Yeah. Oh, it's always the targeting of the women. We're on question 4, Leah. So about the gender aspect. And, you know, from what I read about the 1974 event was that women were targeted, and the Cypriot women were targeted by the Turkish army. Is that something that is spoken about, or is there any public discourse about it, or is that sort of swept under the carpet?
I think the protagonist of all this is that the fighters were men, the decisions to enter war was men, men made war. This is the most important thing one should keep, that it was a war for men by men. I hate to say that women were victims. In most wars, women are victims. They don't even roll to the army, or they shouldn't, or should, I don't know. But whatever, it's men who make the war. It's been said so many times, and it continues to be so today. All these power people, these big seats are men. And there is a great movement, Hands Across the Divide, where women in Cyprus are trying to have their voices heard for any solution. But there are very few in the government, and it's so corrupt anyway, you know, this whole, you know, but you know, okay. But men for men, by men, yes.
But the gender violence.
We know this.
Yeah, the gender-based violence.
You want to, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. The power always pick on the non-powerful one. It's everywhere. It's not just Cyprus. It's, if you look at every war, they're picked on.
Yeah.
It's and the weaker is the ones who get hit first. The easy victims. But I refuse to think about this easy. I mean, it's there, but I would rather talk about getting those men out of those power seats. How on earth are we going to do this? Get our women power back collectively and try to solve this. Get them out of their seat. You know, done forever. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Nadine and Gail, if you would like to say
I'm
anything.
sorry.
No. Hey, we have strong feelings about this topic. Don't even get me started on that.
Yeah, I would like, my addition would be, at least in our own context, what happens with women in this context is that they get relegated to specific roles that become the appropriate roles for them to be in, and usually these roles are, I would say, the roles of being a symbol, and nothing more than that. So in this context, like when it's convenient, you use the symbol and you wave it as a symbol of purity, or when there's bombing, you always say, so like this amount of women and children were killed, you know, so the women just become a symbol in this conflict. And for me, I would say that they suffer double the violence, once through the occupation that we're going through, and the occupation of the foreigner who's taking over our lands. And then second, it's the societal violence and the patriarchy from your own people that tightens its grip on you, especially when you're living in an outer context that's so violent. In the end, it's going to be expressed on the women. But I think the more interesting topic to talk about is really how Palestinian women are relegated only specific roles that it's appropriate to be in. So for example, the mother of the martyr, and how she's supposed to behave, and what she's supposed to be, and what she's supposed to project to the outer world if her son becomes a martyr. You know, how she's supposed to dress and behave in public, and what kind of strength she's supposed to show the people. So she becomes a symbol in and of herself, that she doesn't behave that way, then she's not the proper kind of mother of the martyr. Or what kind of prisoner you should be if you're an imprisoned Palestinian woman. So one example of that would be of Ahed Tamimi, who was arrested as a teenager by Israeli soldiers because she slapped a soldier. And she and her family had been famous because of their resistance to the occupation since they were kids. So if you followed Palestinian news, you would always see them, because the violence against them was daily. And they would be out there with the women and the children and the men. They would be out there trying to prevent the soldiers from coming into the village, from arresting people, from taking over more lands, they would try to prevent settlers of taking lands of their village. But as she grew older, and as she became a teenager, and you know, she wasn't this pure, innocent little girl anymore who's fighting a soldier, the perception of her and the image of her began to take a larger role. And then when she was arrested, two things happened. One was that there was strong sympathy for her, and I think part of that was that she did not present as what people thought as Arabs. So she's blonde and she's blue or green-eyed. She's white. So I think Westerners immediately felt sympathy for her and empathized with her, because here's someone that, oh, she does not look Arab. How come she's arrested? So there's that dynamic on the one hand that's being inflicted upon her. And there's that dynamic that we're aware of is happening. But then on the other hand, there's this whole dynamic from the inside coming out, which is how she's dressing and why is she out there and why is her hair out like that? Or when she came out of prison, people commented on how come she did not lose weight while she's in prison. Because if you're in prison and you're a poor old victim being imprisoned, you're supposed to, I don't know, shrink or something. But she did not shrink. She just became fuller and bigger and, more present. And I think people like that on the one hand, but on the other hand, it did not exactly fit the image of what a Palestinian young woman is supposed to look like when she's resisting. And that came from multiple directions, from multiple sides. And I think these are the dynamics that it's interesting to look at, beyond the violence and beyond the victimhood that was already mentioned here. There are multiple other discourses that are happening around our bodies and around how we're presented and how we're used as symbols that I think need to be explored and discussed.
Yes. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Gail, I don't want to move on without hearing from you, if you want to say or add anything to it.
Yeah, I mean, just what Nadine was saying, a lot of the things you were saying, Nadine, I was sort of nodding my head that this idea of during times of conflict, women who don't behave as they should, and I touched on it.
Yep, you did.
About the woman trying to maintain the household and sort of maintain normalcy, but there's also another thing as well that during the Troubles anyway, women who crossed maybe, if you want to call it, some sort of ideological barrier and didn't behave as they should, often in a very humane way, who were punished. So on the one hand, you have women maybe in the 70s going to discos and dating a soldier who would have been seen as collaborators, much as they might have, during or after World War II, where they had this hideous practice where they tied them to a post and poured tar on them and feathers, and they left there on public display for everybody to see. You dated a soldier, you crossed that divide and did what you shouldn't do. But there was also several cases of what we call the disappeared. But one case that just always sticks in my mind was a woman called Mary McConville, who had tried to help a soldier who had been shot outside of her apartment, and she came out as a human being just to try and help someone who had been shot. And she was in what we call a mixed marriage, Protestant Catholic marriage, which also was, not behaving as you should at those times. But then as she was abducted, aged from about maybe 12 years old, right down to a baby. And that was it, that those children never saw their mother again. And I think it took it was only in recent years that there's a whole series of forensic archaeology going on to try and recover the bodies of these disappeared. And they finally found Mary McConville's remains, and her children now are in their 40s, 50s plus. This brings us back to generational trauma, because her granddaughter, whom she'd never met, spoke very movingly about how she had been traumatized seeing how her father's life had played out, who had been a baby when his mother had been abducted and disappeared. So that was a particularly vile case of a woman being punished for not behaving as she should. The expectation was you ignore a dying man on your doorstep, but as a human being, she took the decision to just try and help from one human being to the next, and that was the punishment that was meted out in her. But there were also other women on both sides replicated the, would also dress in paramilitary uniform. Involved in the abduction of Mary McConville, telling her we just need to go for a chat. He actually drove her over the border and was part of that disappearance. And of course, there were women's prisons where women who had been involved in the conflict were in prison, and there's a whole set of stories there. So it's just very interesting that in times of conflict or post-partition, what happens to women when they behave or don't behave as they should, however that behavior might be, the different responses that brings.
Yep.
How should a woman behave during conflict? I don't know. How should anybody behave? But it seems that it's particularly some of the punishments here that were dealt out to women were particularly vile.
Yeah.
I think because the punishments are just punishing them for being women, more so than for their behavior. Whereas if when men are dying or are being punished in conflict, it's for actions that they do. Whereas women, the punishment is always based on their gender, to humiliate them as a woman in as much as possible. And I think that's the big difference, and why it's important to specifically mark this and talk about this as different than being, than dying during a conflict or because you're taking active part in a conflict.
Yeah.
I just say, my mother is one of the first women surgeons in Cyprus.
Mhm.
And during the war, she was frontline. Even when the hospitals were bombed, she was looking after the whole thing. And she was later given a medal for her bravery and so forth. And just to balance all this, not all women are victims. And I think it's amazing for me to grow up with such a feminist mother.
Yes.
Through war, she never lost her not courage, not only courage, of course not. She didn't bat an eyelid, like, Call of Duty. So that's kind of cool. Growing up with both parents, they were both doctors during the war, both frontline. I could have lost them both, left us in a basement for months, but it was for a good cause and we're very proud. So
was it an
so
adult?
just found the victim woman, that out, just to put that out there.
But was an adult with you? Like, did you have your grandparents with you when they were working, or just
Older sibling?
older siblings? So you just you kids by yourself while they were out working in the hospitals.
For a good cause. Healing the wounded, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
So, but it's this act of bravery really gives you an example of human achievement also.
Yes,
Call
absolutely.
of Duty.
Yeah.
And this cerebral thing, maybe I have this, maybe it's from my both my parents. Get to the point, no victim, look to the future. How can you solve this?
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the geography, get over it.
Yeah. So we are at our last question, and I know we are a little bit over time. So, we can make this as short or as long as we have the appetite for. So the last question is, what are your thoughts about a comparative discourse of partitions where we juxtapose the partitions of Palestine, Bosnia, India, Pakistan, Cyprus, Germany, Mexico, and Native America? And here, it's not exactly that I am asking for like a point-by-point comparison between one partition and another partition. Obviously, there are geopolitical differences. I'm talking about sort of juxtaposing these different partitions in one conceptual space of an exhibition. Like, what does that do? Like for a while before the exhibition, wondered if this was tenable or not, and then I just sort of went with it because I was like, well, if it's not, it's not, I fall flat on my face is fine. But as I was sort of installing the exhibition and looking through it and walking through it, multiple times, I kind of had my own experience of feeling like it all just came together for me. But as participating artists from such different experience, geopolitical specifics, how do you feel about being in an exhibition space like this? Where your work might be next to somebody, making work about the partition of Ireland or the partition of India or the partition of, Cyprus or whatever it is, does that feel productive? Or does that feel like, oh, this is ridiculous? Oh, and I'm joking when I say that, I'm being facetious, but what does that do for you, if anything?
If I
I
may
think as
start
an artist
again.
person.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gail. Gail, go ahead.
I can only answer as an artist, maybe, and say personally, it's great to be involved in any exhibition, number one, and in an exhibition abroad that has other participating artists who are also international is great, because for me, on a it elevates your practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's great for your CV, all of those sorts of things, which are wonderful, and I thank you, Pratika, for doing it. But
oh my goodness, thank you.
without being there in person, it's hard to sort of get a feel of the exhibition. But I get a feel from this conversation how well the work had maybe been able to converse with each other. Again, you sort of need to be there in person to see it. In terms of a comparative discourse, I wasn't thinking when I sent the work about anybody else's work. So you don't know how it's going to sit or how it's going to be received, or even what way as a curator you're going to hang it. Yep. You just hope that it has something to say both about your own experience of partition or conflict or the troubles, but it also resonates with somebody else's work on what they have to say. So I think all the different countries that we've been talking about, and all the individual stories and all the individual family histories, it's massive, so fair play to you for condensing that down and making something meaningful from it.
Yep.
I feel that it's an exhibition that could maybe go on in a development of like sort of artistic exchanges or something like that, so that you might come and learn more about somebody else's home country and what they've been through, and it would be too much to do it for everybody probably, but maybe that way, that more intimate exchanges to learn more deeply. But just for me personally, I'm delighted to have been part of this discourse and to have met everybody tonight, and I think it's been great working with you.
Thank you. That is such a great idea about artist exchanges. And thank you for your kind words, Gail. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah.
Sabine?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good idea to make this a traveling exhibit. I think that's a fabulous idea. I really think so.
It's been on my mind.
Yeah, there you go. But personally, when I saw the topic and I applied, I just got so much validation out of it, that I'm on the right track with my work, that my work is valid, that my work needs to be seen, and that there's other people out there working in the same line. So when I submitted, I was very much in the headspace of there's like-minded people out there, they tell a story, and our joint mission is to just point it out. Look, it doesn't matter where you go, the outcome is the same. You cause partition, it comes at a cost, it causes trauma, it gets handed down. And I thought, like, yeah, here's an opportunity. Finally, someone, you, is putting this all together and puts the work in to make this heard. And I think it's a fantastic platform. And yeah, I appreciate that very, very much, because I think these are stories that need to be told. And you only reach people by telling stories. And that's the contribution we can make. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being part of it. You're on mute.
I think apart from the specific geopolitical things, contextual things that all our work comes from, after that, as it's been clear today, like there are more similarities fundamentally in all our work. And once we got talking, I think it just, as an artist, it's so enriching to hear others working in a similar space and on similar issues, on their perspectives. It's just very, very valuable, I think. And yeah, I think I'm very grateful to you and to the gallery for having me be a part of this. I think it's a wonderful idea for if this could be somehow made into a traveling exhibit.
Yeah.
And just to have this kind of an exchange again. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anat. Each one of your works are such a crucial part that, like, like if you had the map of the world, there would be pins on so many places and, threads connecting those pins. I mean, each one of your works is an important pin on my map for this exhibition. So. Nadine, Leah.
Yeah, we're just joining saying thank you. I wish I had the chance to see the exhibition. You and I had a conversation before this because I was hesitant about the participation and about this kind of framing for my work. It seemed, like a box, or it seemed distant to how I work. But yeah, thank you for the opening up these conversations and between us. I think it's been enriching for me, and I just wish I had been able to experience the exhibition and the space itself.
I know. Well, hopefully once we have the digital scan up, the 3D scan up, it'll give you a bit of a flavor for it, but it's not the same, obviously, as being physically there. But I hear you. I hear you about artists, a lot of artists don't like their work to be put in a box, and that's completely valid, but I guess my goal was to kind of pull out these themes, and not to say that your work is only about that, but to pull those themes out from the works and see if that can happen, that sort of thing. So just to tease it out, Leah, you get the last word.
I feel like I'm the ambassador of my country in a way. And, when I talk about the Cyprus issue, I try when I exhibit my work that people, when they see it, will what they will take out of it as the ambassador of this piece, that we have gone through war, we've survived through war. What can we take out of this is that my conclusion with this art piece is that we must learn to love our neighbor and live with each other. I'm sorry, it sounds preachy, but this is it. I will love my neighbor. If it's he writes it like a punishment 1,000,000 times until it just sinks in. This is our future. Collectivity, live with each other. With all our differences, find something unique about each other and try and like it.
What a profound point to make. The partitions are all about dividing people and, creating these fissures between people. And I guess fundamentally the goal of these kind of cultural practices is to sort of subvert those political agendas of division and to bring people together. So yes, you make a great point. Thank you. All right, my dear artists, this has been so wonderful. I'm sorry for being over time, but I could talk to you guys for another 2 hours if time were no issue. Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing your works and in sharing your time, for your engagement. And most of all, I mean, thank you for making the work you make. My God, the world is a better place because of the works each one of you makes. And I want to say that to you because there will be days in your practice where you'll be like, what am I doing? Why am I making this work? So just remember, you've got one fan. For sure. I joke with my husband that I make my work for 3 people in this world because those are the only my best friend, one of my professors and my partner, my husband, these are people who get my work. And that's okay.
That's funny, but we're reaching a lot more people now with a talk like this with the show. And I think a talk like this complements it, and that this is recorded and we can share that, and some people will take the time, and and we can support each other's work now too. So there's new fans.
Yes. So after this, my first thing would be to get the digital scan up on the partitionmuseum.online website. Then to process this video and post this on social media, on YouTube, on the partitionmuseum.online website. And then I have the plan to also make a catalog. So we have the lookbook, which you have the PDF of, but to also take the time to make a catalog for this work. So for this exhibition particularly, it's I would say out of all the exhibitions I've curated, this is my big one. This is the one that I'm the proudest of, the one that really came together for me conceptually. And I really want to sort of, document it properly in a catalog. So you'll be hearing from me for a few months.
Looking forward to that.
All right.
Thank you, Pritika.
Thank you
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great meeting you, everyone.
Nice meeting
Thank you
you
so much.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.